This is Join Us in France, episode 51. Hello, I'm Annie, and I apologize for my voice. I'm still not all better from my cold, but I can't let that stop me, right? So just bear with me. Now, what you just heard is not the normal opening music for Join Us in France, but rather it's the French Parliament singing La Marseillaise a few days ago. Now, singing La Marseillaise is not something we do, especially not inside a parliament. Apparently, it hadn't happened since World War I, so it's a big deal. And, it's kind of fun to hear that they're not great singers. And also, it points out how many men are in parliament. We should have more women in there. Anyway, so I'm releasing this episode on January 17th, 2015, in the wake of the attacks on the Charlie Hebdo weekly satirical newspaper that took place on January 7th. And because some of you may be listening to this episode a long time from now, let me give you a brief recap of what happened. 17 innocent people died in the attacks of that day. The attacks took place in 3 different places. The Charlie Hebdo headquarters, where 12 were killed, a Kosher grocery store in Paris, where 4 were killed, and also a female police officer was shot and killed on the street. There were hostage taken in a small town northeast of Paris, while the brothers involved were trying to flee, but none of them died, thankfully. As far as we know, there were 3 perpetrators, 2 brothers who worked together, and 1 lone gunman who but they all knew each other and they coordinated their attacks. The lone gunman's girlfriend was involved in the planning, but she did not participate in the attacks. Apparently she was in Turkey or Syria. She's being chased down right now. All of them claimed responsibility, so there is no doubt that they're the ones who did it, is what I'm trying to say. They even called a TV station while the events were going down, and the TV station put them on the air, which is probably wasn't a good idea, but ratings. One of these guys had Al-Qaeda training. The other said he was doing this to help ISIL, the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant. Now, this is funny. The French news organizations never call it ISIL. They call it by its Arabic acronym, Daesh, because that's more of it has more negative connotations and it annoys them, so that's why they do it. Anyway, those are the facts that we know at this point. Now, if the idea was to silence Charlie Hebdo, it is not going to work. This weekly used to print, I've heard all sorts of numbers, anywhere between 30,000 and 40,000 copies, and it was only in French. This week, they printed 3.5 million copies in 18 languages, and they ran out within minutes. So they're doing a reprint of several million more. So these attacks brought so much attention to this small weekly satirical paper that now they have a lot more people interested in them. Another thing that's happened as a result of this is that 10,000 members of the military forces have now been assigned to the protection of Jewish and Muslim religious sites and businesses. So there are 10,000 more police chasing down the bad guys. There are, of course, wannabe jihadists that are trying to attack Jewish establishments, and also retaliations against Muslims all over the country. There are too many to recount, but so far none have been lethal, thankfully. But there are going to be 10,000 more police watching over all of these yahoos. So that's probably not what they wanted to achieve, but they did. The demonstrations over the weekend were so big that they really surprised everyone a little bit. There were 1.5 million people in the streets in Paris alone. And even in rather small French towns, you had significant gatherings. So, we had 40 or so world leaders came to Paris to march in solidarity. On Facebook, I said that it was 60, but it was while it was happening, and they hadn't narrowed down a count, yet. But, that's a lot of people showing up in support of free speech. So, silver lining kind of thing. It was a terrible, terrible, terrible thing that should have never happened. But it's changing things. It seems to have really stirred something in people that is important. Now, what was Charlie Hebdo? What was their shtick? Well, Charlie was and will probably continue to be a weekly that seeks to be disturbing and really rub people the wrong way. Occasionally they're funny, but that's really not the point. The point is it's kind of a brainy, intellectual kind of weekly, and they draw cartoons and they add boobs and penises everywhere. It's just they were really, really trying to be disturbing. And they probably drew more nasty cartoons of French political leaders, especially the right wing, like, Jean-Marie Le Pen and Marine Le Pen, than they ever did of Mohammed. I mean, they were really trying to dish it out all over the place. They probably made fun of motherhood and apple pie and sweet kittens. I mean, I don't know. I didn't read it, but, it was just their shtick was not everybody's cup of tea, not mine particularly, but, that's freedom of speech, right? It's really unsettling. So, why did French people react so strongly in defense of Charlie Hebdo when there has been previous attacks on cartoonists, famously the one against Theo van Gogh in Amsterdam, and that brought a response, but nothing like that big. Why did it strike a nerve like this? Well, I think that it has to do with the way French people are very, very attached to two national values, free speech and secularism. And in these attacks, both free speech and secularism were being, challenged. The French Revolution, it was fought both against the king and the clergy. In the French Revolution, the cathedrals were sacked. They were used as stables. The churches were closed. The nativity scenes couldn't be done anymore, so people brought them inside and did the little santon, miniaturized. It was really, those were really terrible times. The clergy was persecuted, just right along with the king. I mean, they chopped off the king's head, but they also went after the clergy. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which was directly influenced by the ideas of Thomas Jefferson and Lafayette, was passed in 1793. And this declaration says that property, liberty, security, and resistance to oppression are fundamental rights. So, resistance to feudalism, the king, and the priest are basic rights in France. This Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen is still the first article of the French Constitution to this day. So, yes, the revolutionaries, they guillotined Louis XVI, but they also sought to tamp down the power of the Catholic Church, which was considerable for centuries in France. So, we don't have a First Amendment in the French Constitution. We don't have that sort of, spelled out neatly freedom of speech kind of thing. But the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen mentions freedom in several articles. So I'm not going to bore you with them, but there's Article 4, Article 10, and Article 11 in particular that point out specific rights having to do with writing, speaking, the fact that freedom means you can do anything as long as it doesn't harm others or as long as it's not outlawed in the Constitution, that you shouldn't be, that nobody should hassle you for your beliefs, be they religious or otherwise, so long as you don't hinder public order as defined by the law, etc. That sort of thing. So, complete separation of church and state in France has been in French law for a long time. I'm not sure when the first time was, but it's been a long time. And so there was an exception during the Vichy regime, during Second World War, where freedom of expression and freedom of the press was not cool all of a sudden. But for the most part, the rest of the time, it has been a basic right. Now, there are some strong differences between France and America when it comes to freedom of expression and separation of church and state. For instance, when Americans say separation of church and state, what they mean is that the state cannot interfere with religion, right? When French people say separation of church and state, they mean that the church cannot interfere with the state. And as a matter of fact, French people do not really have a problem with the state interfering with religion in France, and I will explain that in a minute. But think about that for a second. It's completely, yes, we both have separation of church and state, but in France, it's mostly the state trying to get the church out of its business and not the state trying to protect religion. It's subtle, but it's a big difference. The point is, for French people, it has been a no-brainer for a long time that you can criticize the clergy in books, in the press, in whatever, and you can do the same for the government. You can say whatever you think, so long as you think it and say it and not do anything violent. We learn in school that France is a secular country. What does that mean? How does it manifest? There is no official state religion in France. Okay? Neighboring countries in Europe have official state religions. England, notably, the Queen of England is the head of the Anglican Church, and so the Anglican Church is the official state religion. In Germany, Austria, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Italy, Sweden, they have a church tax. It's a tax imposed on you in exchange for the right to declare yourself a member of that church, and the government keeps track of it. So if you don't pay the church tax, you don't get a church funeral. You can't get your kids christened, whatever. According to Wikipedia, in Germany, the Catholic Church collects 9.2 billion euros each year from that church tax. And it's not the Catholic Church gathering the money, it's the German government that then pays it back to the Catholic Church. Now, that to me is outrageous because, you pay a church tax just like you pay a income tax. It's not a suggested contribution. It's a tax. I mean, that's just crazy. That would never fly in France. Of course, you can donate to any church you belong to, or you can donate to religion, but the state will not collect any fund for any church, right? There are no official days of prayer. Even with Charlie Hebdo, they called for a big march, but no day of prayer. No chaplains in parliament. We don't put in God we trust on the money. It's all secular. The French president will never utter the words, God bless France, right? Because that would really antagonize a lot of the public. Now, if the Pope says it, that's fine. He's the Pope. He can say that. But for a politician to say that, not cool. Not done. Even when American politicians come to France, and you know how Americans are always saying, oh, God bless America, right? Well, when they come to France, they change their tune. It's now Vive la France, right? So long live France, but no God bless France. Because if they said that, we would immediately not take them seriously. Because if a person wears their religion on their sleeve, obviously they cannot be trusted. You may have heard of of course you've heard of Molière, but he wrote a play that was first produced in Versailles in 1664. So that's a long time ago, right? 1664. It's called Tartuffe ou l'imposteur. And he wrote it commissioned by the king. The main character, Tartuffe, is an impostor who wears his religion on his sleeve to manipulate and con people. Now, we learn that play in French school to this day. So it's not like it's a new idea. This is an idea that's been very, very strong in French minds for a very long time. And while I'm talking literature, why not Voltaire? The phrase, I disapprove of what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it, it was attributed to Voltaire. Apparently, it was incorrectly attributed to Voltaire. But he completely fought for secularism and freedom of speech his whole life. And he was doing it in a very ironic kind of tone. That was his shtick. And there's a strong... Charlie Hebdo also uses irony to point out problems with the world. So it's an old tradition in France. Now, in 1905, the French passed a law that put secularism in the heart of French life in the law. We already felt that way, but now it's in the law, 1905. With that law, all religious buildings, be they churches, temples, synagogues, mosques, whatever, all of them were nationalized. That means that they became public domain. The government took ownership of these places, told the clergy to get the heck out. Well, they could still use the building, but official ownership belonged to the state. And so the church in the village does not belong to the Catholic Church. It belongs to the mayor. Well, not the mayor personally, but to the city, okay? Now, it's a fact that in France, we have a lot of churches, mostly Catholics, but some others too. And if you're a people who do not trust the church very much, like I've explained just now, what do you do with all these churches? What are your choices? Well, you control the churches. You own the building. That's how the French state decided to control religion. Religious leaders still get to do their thing inside of the church and in the mosques and the synagogues and whatever, but they have to play nice with the secular powers and not the other way around. The Catholics hated this, and they fought it tooth and nail at the time, and they lost. The Protestants were a little bit more open to it because, it's not so bad. I mean, the city now owns the building, but now the city has to pay for the upkeep of the building. So that's not such a bad thing. So as a French taxpayer today, I contribute to the upkeep of the church in my village. The mayor decide how much or how little to spend on their churches. Some churches, they get sold. The mayor doesn't want them, says, oh, we don't want that, sell it. It becomes a home or a concert hall or something. It's up to the mayor. In my village, the church is kept very nicely. They light it at night. The bells ring every half hour. Thankfully, they turn them off at night. The renovations are done as soon as they're needed. It's the guy who's been the mayor here since the dawn of time really likes the church and takes care of it. In other villages, the church is completely abandoned. It falls to pieces. Nobody cares. And that's why you find villages in France where the church is completely falling apart. And in others, they're lovely. They're beautiful. It's a political decision on the part of the elected officials. And if the people didn't like it, they would vote the guy out or the girl out, right? Well, in some places, they don't care, and that's just fine. That's just fine. So when I was the president of the local kids choir, whenever I organized a concert, I had to run it both by the mayor and the priest, and they keep a schedule to see when we can use stuff. It never caused any problems, it's fine. It's just instead of making one phone call, you have to make 2 phone calls to make sure that the place is available. So there you have it. The most secular state in the world owns thousands of churches. Actually, it's the villages and the towns that own the churches, but you get my meaning. Notre-Dame de Paris is not owned by the Catholic Church. It belongs to the people of Paris. To the city hall is in charge. Obviously, when you're inside, they get to do church things, and that's fine. That's fine. But, they need to be nice to each other, and so that's why they did that. Now, this 1905 law also says that the state can now subsidize religion by helping out religious organizations. I talked about before how France has a bazillion associations, right, for sports, arts, whatever. And it turns out that the cities and villages fund these associations in large part. So, like if you're the president of a soccer club, you need to use the soccer field, right? So the city gives you a bill every year. They say, well, for the use of the field, it'll be X amount. And with their other hand, they give you a grant for that same amount. So, but they organize it that way so that no matter how long the club uses the soccer field, it belongs to the city. Okay, but if you're a religious organization, if you are religious education or missionary work or charity or that involves some preaching, you cannot get funds from your village or your cities. You can't even apply. There's some exceptions in Alsace-Lorraine. There's 3 departments where they didn't change that. The 1905 law did not modify that. It has to do with... they're close to Germany, and in some ways they accept religion better than French people, I guess. It must be cultural, but I didn't really look into it. Now, in 2004, the French Parliament passed another law on religion that really turned the screws even more on religion. And I'm not going to get into it because this podcast is going to be plenty long without it. I might do another podcast about it another time, but I'm not even sure. Because it's so controversial, and it's the one that has to do with covering your face and the burqa and all that. So, in France, we take secularism very seriously, and we even have 2 words for it. We have the words secularisme and laïcité. There's some subtle distinctions between the two, but I'm not going to talk about that either because it would just take me off in a different direction. So, all of these marchers in France who say "Je suis Charlie," they get the right to do that by virtue of the fact that we're a secular country and we believe in free speech. It's been part of our culture for a very, very long time. Now, these satirical newspapers are not always very popular. I told you at the beginning, Charlie Hebdo was not very popular, as a matter of fact. The precursor to Charlie Hebdo was a magazine called Harakiri, and I remember it because when I was younger, that's the one we sometimes read. Harakiri is the name, the ritualistic disembowelment that the Japanese sometimes do. It's called seppuku as well. Well, that magazine certainly lived up to that name. They were really trying to be disturbing and abrasive and funny and all of that. Offensive never bothered them. And as a matter of fact, offensive doesn't bother French people as a rule. One week, there was a fire at a dance hall that killed a lot of people. And the press went crazy reporting on it and how many people. And they did fluff stories and all that. And talking about, gathering testimonial and pictures and the TV press and all of that. And they really, really milked it, right? And if you watch CNN or Fox News or any news outlet today, the press milks tragedy, right? That's what they do. There's a tragedy. They descend on it and they report on it and they tell you over and over and over and over again what it was. And it just goes into this crazy stuff. And the people at Harakiri thought that was outrageous and they wanted to talk against it. And what they did is the following week, they put on their cover, "Balle tragique à Colombey, un mort." Okay, what they were trying to say is that the one dead was the press. That really the press showed how irrelevant it was by completely giving in to this desire to sell papers by covering this thing that unfortunately nobody could do anything about. The people were dead, It's pointless to keep reporting on something like that you cannot do anything about, while at the same time you're ignoring other issues that you could possibly do something about. Anyway, it was their position, and it just about killed the paper because French people thought that was really so outrageous to insult the dead in that way. So the readership went down even lower, and they had to give it up. A few years later, essentially the same people started Charlie Hebdo, and their shtick continued to lampoon and poke fun and make people feel uncomfortable and all of that. Charlie was never super popular. It did better than the Harakiri, but most people didn't buy it. And that's because, they were, they were trying to make you think. They weren't trying to make you laugh. They were trying to make you think. Some people get it. Most people don't. And fundamentalists of all stripes, they don't get it, and they don't really want to get it. And whether they be religious fanatics or political leaders who are very extreme in their views, thinking outside of the box is not their thing, and they don't get it. And so they get outraged and they go on the attack instead. But French people culturally think it's important to keep that sort of critique alive. And we think it's okay to blaspheme. This is something that we have to acknowledge about ourselves. French people think it's okay to be blasphemous. It's okay to be tasteless. It's okay to use stereotype. It's okay to even say racist things. Think about that for a minute. This is a society that thinks that so long as all you do is say it or think it, that's fine. So long as it doesn't influence your, so long as you don't hit people or hurt people. So, yeah, that's uncomfortable from an American perspective, right? It's, as a student, when I first went to the U.S. for college, I remember reading the student newspaper, and there was something about a problem with kids doing a party, and they were doing the blackface thing. So it was white kids, obviously, and how offensive that was. And I thought, why is that even offensive? Because we don't necessarily do that, but in France, you see all kinds of tasteless and racist things happening, and people's attitude is like, well, grow thicker skin. It's just speech. It's okay. All right. So a lot of French people don't want to grow thicker skin, and they don't go buying these kinds of newspapers. But now that they've been made into martyrs, well, it's going to be huge. Now, even if you don't like tasteless, and I don't either, and even if you think that saying racist things is not a good thing, and I agree with that too. I think it's not good to use stereotypes, etc. But you have to understand that when fundamentalists, and I don't mean just religious fundamentalists, it can be political fundamentalists or both political and religious, when they react violently, okay, that's human nature, right? You find yourself insulted and you have a reaction, a strong reaction, emotional reaction. Okay, that's one thing. But then if you take it to the next step and you start killing people, that's quite another thing. And I think the people who are thankfully in the minority, in the very, 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 very tiny minority, who take it to the next level and start killing people, they act on an impulse that has to do with being totalitarian. I really think that it's about control. See, if I get mad, somebody insults me or whatever, I get mad, but I will talk myself down, right? There are people who believe that the right thing to do is not to talk yourself down, but to go on the attack. And that, I think, comes out of an impulse that's totalitarian. They want to control what others say, what others think, because a cartoon, no matter how tasteless, will never hurt anyone. And they know that. Even the people who perpetrated these crimes, they know that. But they think that once they've been provoked, it's okay to lash out. And it's okay to lash out so that they can control what others say and do. So, I think they're control freaks. I think that's a problem with a lot of human nature, people who don't learn how to mitigate their emotions and do something positive with their emotions. I mean, they could have done so many different things to try and stop these things, but they don't. They just lash out and shoot. And why do I feel this way? I think religious crazies, and every religion has them, and thankfully, there's 6 billion Muslims in the world. Every few weeks, a few of them do something so outrageous. But it's the tiny, 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 tiny minority. It's such a small number. Most Muslims would never, even if they get angry, they're not going to start shooting people. They're not like that. They don't. It's clear. They don't. We see it. So it's not like we should condemn the religion as a whole, because you can find, you don't have to dig very far to find horrible things that the Catholics have done or Jews have done or whatever. So that's one part of the issue. Now, let's go back to free speech for a minute. Since we're so enamored with free speech in France that we even allow, really tasteless stuff to go on, does that mean that anything goes? Well, no. That does. In France, and we're a country of many paradoxes, there are some things you cannot say. Let me explain. After World War II, as you know, France was divided into two areas. It was a diagonal kind of thing. A lot of the north of France was occupied by the Germans, and so was ruled and run by the Germans. And the south capitulated. So they elected, in quotes, a president who went along with whatever Hitler said. His name was Pétain, and it's called the Vichy government. So they were collaborating with the enemy, is what it is. The regime of Vichy rounded up and sent a lot of Jews to their death in Germany. This is not something we're proud of, but it did happen. And the French had to come to acceptance and acknowledgement that this had indeed happened. So once France finally accepted responsibility for the deportation of Jews during the Second World War under the Vichy regime, it took a long time to get there. And they had to wait for a lot of, dinosaur, old reactionary political leaders to die off before they could acknowledge this. And so it was a big, big step. And so the rule has become, we don't want any sliding backwards into denying that we were involved. And so if the International Court of Law, which is in The Hague, if the International Court of Law declares that an event is a genocide, then in France, by law, you cannot deny that it was a genocide. So that would include the Shoah. It would include the Armenian genocide and many others. And this is, like I said, in an effort for French people to not slide back into denialism, right? Which we engaged in for, I don't know how long it lasted, but it was a few decades. So, in order to not backslide and go back to denying this stuff, there are laws. And the laws say that if you are a public person, be it sports, entertainment, politics, a famous author, whatever, if you, in the public eye, you're a known person, you will get fined if you use anti-Semitic language or deny the Holocaust, the Shoah, or any other Holocaust that has been declared as such by the International Court of Law. If you're a nobody and you're just talking as a private individual, it's fine. Nothing will happen. But if you're a famous person, you will get fined, and it's happened for some of these people to be thrown in jail. Right now, there's a French performer, he's called Dieudonné, and he makes anti-Semitic remarks all the time. He's an attention seeker. He's been doing this for years. He says it's his free speech, whatever. But since he's a public person, he's very much in the newspapers all the time. They just arrested him this week for praising terrorism and calling for terrorist acts. So, it can be pretty bad. Another example is Brigitte Bardot. She's the former actress, beautiful woman. She was an animal rights activist for a long time. But of late, she's become kind of a right-wing wacko. And she's in her 80s or something. I mean, she's not a young person anymore. And she's published an invitation for her followers to hurt Muslims over their treatment of lambs during the Eid celebrations. Well, if you call for violence against a group, she's a public person, so she got slapped with a fine. She published that again, and she got slapped with another fine. So there are things you cannot say in France. It's just a fact. Now, as a result of these events, there's been usually it's young men who get drunk or belligerent, and they start screaming at the crowds, that you're in favor of jihad and you're going to come back with a Kalashnikov or whatever. You threaten people. The police are going to arrest you right away, and will put you under scrutiny and find whatever they can about you and see if they can hold you a long time. So, right now there's not a lot of tolerance for this sort of behavior, and it's anyone that had anything to do with these terrorists will be investigated and hassled. We don't have it at Guantanamo Bay. We're probably not going to torture these people, I would venture, but it's not going to be pleasant. Like a couple of days ago in the newspaper, I ran about a man originally from Haiti. He lived in France for a while, and now they just arrested him in Bulgaria because he had called the two brothers that were perpetrators here several times over the last few months. So maybe he was plotting with them. Maybe he was just calling about, I don't know, something he wanted to, party or something. Who knows? But they are going to follow every trail, and they are going to look at all these people who had anything to do with this. Unfortunately, this week there was an arson fire at a German newspaper that reprinted some of the Charlie Hebdo cartoons, and I'm afraid it's not going to stop. I mean, it's, the police are going to put pressure on these people. They're going to trail them and all that. But it's really hard to stop fundamentalists from acting out, from lashing out from their anger and their desire to control things. Because what we'd have to do really is to convince them that they are doing wrong by their God or something. You have to convince them on their own turf that they're doing wrong. And that's really hard to do so. And of course, the press in America will not touch this stuff with a 10-foot pole. They're saying that reprinting these cartoons goes against their standards, or that what Charlie was doing was hate speech. Okay, I think that's outrageous, honestly. They don't get it, and they don't really want to get it, because why should they? They might find themselves at the wrong end of a Kalashnikov. Of course they don't want to get it. It's kind of cowardly, and they'd rather not go there, and I get it. I'm not that brave myself. But there's this one American who I thought was wonderful. American cartoonist who's been living in France for a decade. His name is Robert Crumb. And I'm going to quote him in an interview that he gave to the New York Observer in a second. He's famous for Fritz the Cat, Keep on Truckin' Guy, and Mr. Natural. And the French newspaper Libération asked Crumb to draw a cartoon in reaction to the Charlie Hebdo attack, and he did, and he drew a great cartoon. Let me read what he says. So this is like an audio interview that I'm going to read out, so it's not going to sound great, but Aline, he says Aline, that's his wife, who's also a cartoonist. She saw something on the internet. All the big newspapers and magazines in America had all agreed, mutually agreed, not to print those offensive cartoons that were in the Charlie Hebdo magazine. They all agreed that they were not going to print those because they were too insulting to the prophet. Charlie Hebdo, it didn't have a big circulation. A lot of French people said, yes, it was tasteless, but I defend their right of freedom of speech. Yeah, it was tasteless. That's what they say. And perhaps it was. I'm not going to make a career out of baiting... I'm not going to make a career out of baiting some effing religious fanatics, by insulting their prophet. I wouldn't do that. That seems crazy. But then, after they got killed, I just had to draw that cartoon, showing the prophet. And the cartoon I draw shows myself holding up a cartoon I've just drawn, a crude drawing of an ass that's labeled the hairy ass of Muhammad. And then he laughed. So... good man, brave man. But most people are not going to be that brave, honestly. And then you have newspapers that are not so good. Like, for instance, the ultra Orthodox Jewish paper, I didn't even get the name, who edited all the female world leaders out of the picture of the Charlie Hebdo march. Right? So you have 40 world leaders that come. Not that many of them are women, but a few are women. And they edit them out because, I don't know, they're ultra-Orthodox. They can't print women's faces or something. That's just crazy. So, you have crazy ideas in all religion and in all extreme political views, I think. So in France, we're siding with secularism because we hope to win the battle of ideas. We hope that by doing that, by educating people into the fact that as a group, we can all agree that religion is a private thing. We hope that'll keep the crazies under control. I don't know if we're right or wrong, honestly, but the French state does not want to know your religion. There are estimates and polls on how many, belong to what religion, who's religious, who's not, whatever. 38% of French people, I read, claim no religion whatsoever, and many more claim to not believe, even if they were christened or whatever. It's against the law for a census taker to ask you what your religion is, and it's not on the census form. Well, why not? Okay, I was told that, imagine if Hitler had the name and address of every Jewish family in Germany or France. Yeah, okay, that's a good point. If the census keeps track of all these things, it makes it kind of easy to go gun them all down. So that's a good point. But also, I think we're sticking our heads in the sand a little bit. Hitler was a long time ago. Maybe we can move on. Maybe we can reconsider. But that's really a hard sell in France. People have religions, and those religions influence them more or less, depending on how seriously they take it. 99.9999% people really like their religion. I mean, most people like their religion, but they're not nuts. They won't go killing over it. And so most people, it's not a problem. It's just a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of people who act out. And I think it's just as much about the religion as it is as an effort to control people. And, you can have any religion you wish in France. We've started some fantastic, bizarre cults in France. And I should really study them and make a show out of it. It would be funny. So we do have freedom of religion in France, but we also have restriction on religion, and we don't think that's a problem. You can be a Scientologist in France, but they got slapped with heavy fines and for deceptive practices a few years back. But I mean, you can still go buy their books on how to become a Superman or whatever it is. The French state does not want to help them by granting them tax-exempt status or donations on donations or buildings or whatever. We tax them and fine them. That's how it goes. A person can refuse medical care based on their religion. If you have a child and you refuse care based on your religion, well, the doctor has to listen to you. But when the doctor goes against the wishes of the parents, they don't get into very much trouble because in France, there is a strong belief that the child does not belong to the parents. So the parents can make decisions, obviously, for the child, but the child needs to be protected and respected as its own person already. And so if the parents are crazy, the state will intervene, and we think that's fine. So far, I've talked to you mostly about the 1905 law, and the show has gone on quite a while, 45 minutes or so. But there was another law later, the 2004 law, that is the one about not wearing religious symbols in French schools or public buildings. You can wear them walking in the streets if you want, but you can't hide your face for safety reason. And I must admit, all the pictures going around of the girlfriend of one of the attackers wearing, a full covering of everything and carrying bow and arrow. Yeah, that's not going to help the cause of letting people walk around the streets like that, because obviously that's dangerous. Anyway, but I'm not going to go into that. I may do it in another episode. But I just wanted to explain how in France secularism is so dear to people, so important to people. And you're supposed to leave your religion at the door. You go to school. You can have your religion. You can do whatever you want in your private time. But you go to school, you leave it at the door. School is to teach everyone, give an education to everyone. and we think it's fine that way. Even in my daughter goes to a Catholic high school. Even at her school, you cannot wear a big cross. It's because it's a Catholic high school, but it gets some money from the government because they've agreed to teach the regular curriculum that all the other high schools teach. And so, if you want to go to Mass, you can, but you don't have to, see? And you cannot wear overt signs of religion, not the teachers, not the students, nobody. So, and we live in this world where the separation of church and state is so important, and it's okay, even for the Catholic Church, even for Notre Dame. Let me play something for you right now. These are the bells of Notre Dame ringing in honor of the killings of January 7th. So this is the cathedral wanting to honor these people. They're just fine with the separation of church and state, right? They are also fighting for freedom of speech and the freedom that Charlie Hebdo was asserting, even to be blasphemous. And that's just fine with the Catholic Church, Notre Dame. You just heard it. So there you go. Okay, well, I'm going to have to stop it here. I do have a couple of announcements. You've noticed, obviously, that the show is going in a different direction. Because I really want to take this show to where it's interviews with travel professionals and people who have interesting and relevant things to say about France. I haven't lined up very many interviews yet because so many events, there's been so many things for me to talk about by myself. But if you are, if you would like to suggest someone who would be interesting for me to interview, or if you're a travel professional who wants to come on the show to tell us about what you do and the place where you do it and all that, email me. It's Annie@joinusinfrance.com. And if everything goes as planned, the interview with Marion Clignier will be aired next week. I didn't have time to edit it. That's why I didn't put it together just yet. All right, I want to say thank you to all of you who support the show by going to joinusinfrance.com/Amazon. When you make your purchases on Amazon that way, it does not cost you any more, but we get a small commission to help pay for the cost of having a show like this on the internet. It's not a big cost, but it's really nice for you to help out that way. In December, we had quite a few people did that. In January so far, nobody's done it. Please go do it. Please, please, please. So joinusinfrance.com/Amazon. Thank you so much, and we'll talk to you next week. Au revoir.